Hi, I'm John Cooter. I'm here with Blair Dunkley, and we're talking about mind models and specifically the history of mind models. And not just because we want a history lesson, but because so often when I'm looking at something and thinking about learning it or starting to practice it, my question is, will this work for me? And I know a little bit about the history and where mind models came from, and I think it'll make it really clear that it will work for just about anybody. So, Blair, when did you develop your first mind model?
Wow. Okay. So I needed to start developing mind models shortly after I became certified as a life skills coach. I started in 1976. I started a company with my mother. She was the trainer. She was trained through a government program that had spent $42 million and 5 years and done 5 years of research identifying things called life skills. And these life skills identify 362 core competencies that people need to be able to problem solve, cope, and become successful in their lives.
That's a bunch.
But it was designed for a different population than what we were going after. My mother's interest, and mine too at the time, was in the area of mental health. And mental health is still so critical today. But the issue was that this was the initial research was done for people who were incarcerated and getting them to cope and problem solve. So on release, they could become successful. So coping, problem solving, and success is what it was. And they had done a bunch of research with psychologists and psychiatrists, had a training and research study for 5 years, like I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
That shut down, and we took that research and actually commercialized it. And had I known what I know now, I probably wouldn't have done it, because I now know that it's a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting a company that commercializes research up and going. It's crazy numbers, as opposed to like 3 out of 10 will survive if you just start a business. But we survived. So we did a great job, and we did this. But I was in the early days, I was losing staff so quickly, people that we trained up as life skills coaches. And I needed to find some of the gaps that weren't in there, because our market was, like I said, mental health. And
How come you were losing staff? What was
well,
happening?
because they were getting overwhelmed, because 80% of our student population was potentially suicidal. So our staff wasn't knowing how to cope with that as well as they needed to. And they weren't able to guide people, coach people through the process, because we didn't have one for that. We had an employment process. We had a learning how to cope and anger management process, lots of processes, but not this one for the mental health side of things.
So were they burning out from stress? Is that?
Yes, exactly. They were coming in, taking the program, doing a great job, but carrying too much weight. So they were taking on the problems of our student population.
Mm-hmm.
So when we started breaking down mind models, I had this thought. In fact, I had two students in front of me. One young guy that was two young men, both the same age, but one from the wrong side of the tracks, one born with a silver spoon in his mouth. And so I could compare those ages of those people, virtually the same year they were born. And I started looking at that. What is it that caused one to zoom ahead and the other one to stay stuck? Well, part of that was how they asked questions. But another part of that was this thing that I eventually called naming and labeling. One would name and label what his issues were, and he could solve it. The other one would have it, feel it, describe it sort of, but it would always be a story. Whereas the other would somehow magically shift his story down into a couple of words or a short phrase. In other words, he named it. And when I saw that, I tested out this whole concept of naming and labeling. It was one of the first mind models. I wasn't calling them mind models back then. I actually called them points of clarity.
Uh-huh.
But these mind models of naming and labeling cause people to shift. And when I got my students to shrink down their stories into a few words, like describing feelings, don't tell me the story that got you to how you feel. Tell me what the feelings are.
Okay.
And all of a sudden, they went from being controlled by their story to having control of the emotions that were generated from the story. It was just the most fascinating thing. And I got that light bulb moment. I got to do more of this. I got to see what else is out there, because that was so effective. And I got my staff doing just naming and labeling to start off with, so they didn't have to carry the story, because they were hearing the story and internalizing the emotion that their student was going through. When they got their student to shift it to the words, the feeling words, all of a sudden the student felt better. Byproduct, so did the coach. They didn't, like, because the student isn't going through all this crap, so neither is the coach. So all of a sudden, naming and labeling became one of those first things that I made sure our coaches did. And so that was this fundamental piece. And we had like this whole history of mental health, and we had like life skills came out of Canadian mental health, and mind models came out of life skills. And because the research that was done to identify, name and label, make it repeatable, duplicate it over, or repeat it over and over again, getting a similar result and duplicating it, transferring it to others, is what that fundamental 5 years of research done by the government was focused on. And so I focused on exactly the same model.
I see.
And we tested every mind model, had to work 80% of the time, or it wasn't kept as an effective mind model. And that's in our student population. And I was able to test these things. Well, I worked on this for over 17 and a half years, developing different ones, but the standard was 80%. There's a funny little story. One of my students who was referred to us by the university, actually, he's a mathematician. He's a student studying math. And at the end of the day, he's also suicidal. And he said he knew what I was doing. I was kibitzing with him and talking to him about these mind models I was testing out. And he said, so to what degree, what amount do you do? How many times when you're working with somebody who's suicidal, what amount, what number of attempts do they let you have reasonably before you have to call in an ambulance or something else, to work it through? And I said, well, you're suicidal. You write it down in your piece of paper. I'll write it down on mine, and we'll compare notes. And so what happened was he had put his number up at the same time I did, and they were both three attempts. And so I found that was fascinating, because him being a mathematician, he said, that's funny. When you evaluate 3 specific things in a row and you make effective improvements, the probability is that you'll get somebody, or you'll get very close, like within 99.9% of the answer, if you do this evaluation 3 times consistently, you'll resolve it down to get it functionally effective. Generally, if you've identified the correct problem, you'll be able to correct that problem within 3 attempts, 99.99% of the time. And I went, wow, we haven't lost anybody, and we didn't lose anybody in 35 years, simply because we worked on getting people resourceful, not having an answer. And so mind models always go after a resourceful state. not providing an answer or a solution, because solutions are fleeting, but a resourceful state, you can carry that into any situation. And that's what made mind models so potent, and that whole history piece of developing it was critical to see how, when we tested these things out, if it was 75 or 60 or 50%, well, we just threw all of those out, unless it was 80%. Because if it didn't work the first time, 80% of the time, the numbers start falling off. It goes like not just from 3 attempts, but to 5, then 7, then 10, then a whole bunch. Like it just explodes out in terms of the amount of attempts you have to have if it's not 80% the first time. And
Okay.
it's too random.
Okay. So in answer to the question, if somebody has in their mind, will this work for me? The answer is there's 35 years of experience with people who are in a very difficult situation, dealing with their mental health issues and potentially suicidal. And that group of people was able to be successful the first time they used
After it was taught. That's
after
the
it was
key.
taught to them. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So they were taught a mind model, and then the first time they tried to use it, they could achieve some level of success with it 80% of the time first time.
Right.
And if they didn't get quite what they wanted, and they made either got retaught or made some adjustment, and over 2 or 3 attempts with small adjustments, 99% of the time successful.
Yes.
And success would be
99.99% of the time, technically.
And success would be some resolution of a problem.
No, not a resolution, a resourceful state. In other words, they could move themselves to a place where they knew, first of all, with the suicidal person, them killing themselves was no longer on the table. They had a problem that they could resolve. They could see a way through to resolve it, not have it resolved. They get resourceful to resolve it.
Okay.
So there's a big difference here. It's not about guaranteed solutions. Not going to say that at all, because it's not. But when you have the means to shift yourself, to cause yourself to examine your life and the problems in your life, so that you can figure out a way to get yourself through the current situation, you're no longer stuck. And that's a huge deal.
Yeah.
Like, you're not stuck, you're not overwhelmed, and you're not frustrated with your situation, because you no longer lack the ability to be able to see your way through. You have the ability. You've done it. You've tested it. You've created a resourceful state in your mind. And most people are then moderately to very excited to go out and test this stuff out and find out what works and what doesn't work for them, because they've got a model to be able to go back and do that again and figure it out. Because it's just the problem that needs to be resolved. And getting resourceful, if you don't think you can, you can't. Because you're not going to take the actions to do this. But if you get resourceful, you have multiple ways of being able to attack the same problem, the same issue, the same situation in your life. And that means it's just a matter of when, not if, you're going to be successful.
Okay, so mind models aren't solutions in themselves, and they're not how to solve a problem. They're how to set yourself up to move forward to be able to solve problems.
Perfect. Yes, because that is a resourceful state. And when you feel like, think about it, when you've got an idea that you haven't done yet, and you think that, hey, this could work for me. Well, you might also go, well, that could work, but this could work too. I'll pick the best one. I'll just pick one of the two that I think is the best one. I'll make a judgment. Okay, I'll try. Boom. But I've got a plan B over here that if plan A doesn't work, I go to plan B. Great. So I don't feel desperate. I don't feel like I've got nothing if plan A doesn't work. I've got a way to do it. And more importantly, I have a way to figure out a plan C and D and E and F because I can get resourceful. And I can pull in other people. I can look at my situation differently. I'm no longer desperate and in need. I am resourceful and moving forward.
That sounds like a good place to be.
Well, yeah, only slightly. When I've taught this to young entrepreneurs and they're in the right market, they've gone from one young gentleman went from making, personal income of 40,000 a year to gross income. Well, I should give you gross to gross. So 400,000 that his net was 40. And then he went to 2 million. And his gross was 6 figures plus. Or his net, sorry.
His net.
Personal income was 6 figures.
Oh yeah, his net went from 40,000 to 6 figures, over 6
Yes.
figures. Very cool.
Yeah. And another one, Earl, young guy, 75,000, and he had a goal of hitting a revenue, a personal income of 300,000 in a year. Well, he sort of learned the mind models in a model which is called Igniting the Buying Conversation, but they're all mind model based and how to get people resourceful and choose and make a buying choice, igniting a buying conversation to choose. Well, he applied that and he took his people or his personal income in 1 year from 75,000 to 1.2 million. The following year, he put together a team and asked me to come in and train them up. So I did, and they did collectively in excess of 30 million.
Nice. Well, so you just answered another really important question that I hadn't yet asked, which is, so are mind models just for, maintaining our mental health, or can they be applied in our business and used to grow our business? And clearly they can be used in business and in any area of our life, right? Is there
every area of our life? I mean, I have a testimony from Fernie, who was with one of my clients in attraction marketing, and they paid me over 2 years over $250,000. But Fernie was shocked because he did not think that the mind model spin-off effect would be in his personal life as profoundly as it was. And so he talks about that in his own testimonial that he gave me, and how mind models and the IBC in particular shifted their company when I trained their staff in IBC, and their income hit a brand new record from the year previous. Was a record of 1.2 million on a weekend summit that they would have. And that year that they hit their previous record was for 450 people. The next year, after I trained up their staff in IBC, they had only 350 people in the at the summit, and they still broke the old record of 1.2 and went to 1.9 million. Now, the really important number is in the previous year with the 350 people, they had a 30% refund rate. In the year that I taught them Igniting the Buying Conversation, they had a 2% refund rate. So they got to keep the lion's share of their money.
Yeah, big difference.
In the bottom line, it's all bottom line related. And that's so critical to everything. So
is there anything else about the history of mind models that?
Well, mind models fit in every area, every aspect of your life. And, back in the early days with the history of mind models, I needed it so badly because my father went into a coma and I was taught mindset. Mindset doesn't work, but that's how come I got into mind models. And so the whole thing was taking the fundamental way that the original research that sort of spawned mind models, which was life skills, and it sort of broke it out into a different direction than life skills was going, and went into how do we actually think? Because life skills is about coping and problem solving and success. So are mind models sort of byproduct, but mind models are more like, how do I think so I can get that, you know, to cope more effectively, problem solve, and be successful in my life in a more predictable way. So it was a little more fundamental and simple, and yet a faster response time and a lot less training needed. So that's what I was able to evolve it into.
Well, wonderful. That's, I mean, it's such an impressive story, and I'm excited to be part of it in the present and looking forward to where we go from here.
It's going to be fun. It's going to be a ride.
Thanks so much, Blair.
You take care. Thanks.